So I wanted to do one on Spinoza and the idea of free will, and I couldn't quite think how to kind of what to hang it on as a kind of idea. But I've just watched the Dugin interview with Carlson, and something that's been sort of bugging me about this whole idea of free will kind of crystallised. So that kind of helped me understand what it was that I was trying to get at with Spinoza. Spinoza famously was a determinist. He believed that everything that was possible was actual. Everything was completely determined by God. He therefore rejected the idea of free will. But he nonetheless held that the striving for human freedom, for self-determination, and freeing ourselves in accordance with our true nature as God's beings, was the the kind of tantamount to salvation, or sort of attaining grace of some kind. So it's a weird view, and I'm not sure I quite got my head around it, because you kind of think, well, you must have free will in order to strive to be free, but it's not easy to get your head around. But I've kind of been sort of rummaging through an entry in I think it's a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, to try to get my head around this thing. And I'll just lay out his basic position in relation to determinism, the relationship of us to God, and so on and so forth, with a few sort of comparisons to kind of Leibniz, which we've kind of gone through before, just to get an idea about this. Before I start that, I just want to say what kind of the motivation of this is. It sort of comes out from Matt Ehret. Often is one of the people that constantly goes on about the idea of human free will, and it's sort of what bugs me about the idea of human free will is what is meant by that now. I mean, what does the idea of free will mean, and how to in a liberal world, this is where it keys in with this Dugin thing, where he's kind of looking at the effects of liberalism and individualism. And so, when people use the word free will now, in what sense are they meaning free will? Because I think it's often taken to be this kind of libertarian or liberal idea of free will. And what interests me is to what extent, Matt obviously wants the idea of free will because he believes in God as being a benevolent creator, and that human beings should strive to conform with natural law, and to do so they need free will, or they need to be able to do it freely in order to distinguish ourselves from just being animals. Animals are sort of dragged along by natural law, but they don't choose to conform to it in the way that a free human being can. So yeah, that's kind of what the motivation of this is really, because you, I think there's we can going back to what Spinoza's trying to do. So what Spinoza's trying to do is to argue for the idea of human emancipation without, in the absence of the idea of free will being a real thing, rather than just it's an illusion as far as he's concerned. And to what extent that idea does actually bring us back more closely to a more kind of traditional idea of free will. Because the idea of free will, like as Dugin points out in this interview, is that you can choose to be whatever you like. You can choose to reject all traditional values. You can choose to divorce yourself from collectivity. You can choose to divorce yourself from the very idea of being human, if you want. And then we go into this transhumanism thing and the post-humanism thing, Schwab's world. So yeah, I think maybe seeing what Spinoza can get us that we kind of want in terms of how we want to conceive of the idea of freedom in the absence of free will might actually give us a better idea of if we are going to talk about free will and having free will and believe in having free will, it might get us closer to what it is we're needing out of free will, in addition to what Spinoza is offering. Because if Spinoza's right, and human emancipation can be achieved in the absence of free will, then it might be better, sort of strategically, if you like, if we didn't go on about free will quite so much, because it's so easily misinterpreted and through the liberal lens, So yeah, that's what's sort of got me thinking about this. So Spinoza on free will. So absolute freedom, that's only God has absolute freedom. Then there's degrees of freedom. So that would include finite beings having degrees of freedom. And then there's something that is approximating to absolute freedom, which is human freedom. So for Spinoza, human freedom is based on gaining a quasi-adequate idea of the kind of causal background against which we're acting, so that we can act according to our nature in conformity with natural law. It's sort of tricky to explain this. I've got a few little analogies later. The musical one's back again, but there's some others as well. So, yeah, God is the origin of the laws of nature. And these are in accordance with his own nature. Both, I'm having to read here because I've made notes and it's so complicated I can't just talk off the top of my head or out my rear end. So both thought and matter are governed by laws of nature, and the order and connection of ideas are the same as the order and connection of things for Spinoza. So we've got, in the same way as Leibniz has got this parallelism between ideas and things, the Spinoza has also got this idea of these two parallel things, but unlike in Leibniz, with Spinoza, this isn't mediated by a realm of substances, of created substances. God is the only substance in Spinoza's idea, and so everything basically goes back to God. So it's like so there's not this intermediate sort of realm, and since everything it comes from God, there's no kind of slippage, if you like, in Spinoza's world. It's pretty much like, gears locked in to one another. Whereas kind of Leibniz, to use a kind of slightly horrible mechanical analogy, the kind of realm of the created substances or the monads is almost like there's a bit of a clutch involved, whereas with Spinoza there's just gears. So there's kind of more of an idea of a bit of sort of slippage in Leibniz's world, although everything is still certain. But because of his idea of the possible worlds, there's this the idea of free will has still got some kind of reality to it, whereas Spinoza, it is an illusion that we have. Where are we? Yeah, so the reason why Spinoza thinks that there isn't a free will is because he believes that the will is identical to the intellect, and the intellect is composed of ideas of the body and ideas of the body's affections, and the mind is composed of individual ideas. An idea already contains affirmations and negations. So for Spinoza, the idea of there being then free will supervening over this is kind of explaining something that is already explained by the ideas themselves. We have an idea that is caused by an idea. That idea already contains affirmations and negations in it. And so the idea that we then need to, in addition to having the idea, affirm or deny the idea, is like a kind of a cycling through the air, like E.T. or something. There's no sort of nothing for it to get any traction on. It's like that is just a kind of an epiphenomenon or an illusory sort of offshoot of having ideas in the first place. So that's why he doesn't really think that we have free will, but he does believe in human freedom. And freedom is the end of human striving. It's not about choice, but about acting or being acted on. So for Spinoza, we act only insofar as we are the adequate cause. So we have a kind of clear and distinct sort of Descartes type idea. Not like Descartes, but that's terminology that Descartes uses, clear and distinct. Clear and distinct idea. So we act according to reason, not passion. And passion for Spinoza is something external to us. It is something that acts on us. So we must act from an inward kind of realization of our nature. And in so doing, when we act in accordance with our nature alone, rather than under the influence of passions, when we do that, we are the adequate cause of our action. So that's kind of essentially where where Spinoza kind of gets us with the idea of freedom. So for if people kind of are thinking about this from a religious point of view, obviously the question of free will is a very complex one in relation to all the different religions in the world, but or even just in relation to Christianity alone. I mean, there's all kinds of controversies about the role that free will plays in the nature of salvation. All the different branches of the Christian faith have various different ideas about this. But I found a kind of useful kind of summary on this, which I've just, here we go, which kind of is a Wikipedia thing, but I couldn't, I don't know really. I'm completely new to this whole subject about freedom within all the different religious faiths. But there's a fella called, where are we? Mortimer Adler, and according to him, there's three kind of ideas of freedom at work in with Christianity, as example, and potentially in other religions. I don't know enough about it, all this. But you've got freedom from constraint, which is like the Exodus. So that's freedom from slavery. So that's freedom in that sense. So that is one type of freedom. Then you've got what he calls natural freedom, which would be the ability to be self-determining. So you're not constrained by anything. So you don't have a kind of negative thing preventing you from being free. But without that, you might just still sit there like a lump of jelly on the plate, without somebody pushing it around, So you also need this sort of self-determination, this ability to kind of act in accordance with your nature. Now, obviously, this idea of nature could be taken to be, I'm free, I'm just going to be what I want to be. It's not that kind of liberal idea of freedom. This is freedom in relation to, in order to have the capacity to act in accordance with your nature, i.e. your essence, your human essence. So that is self-determination. And then you have something he calls acquired freedom, which is having kind of begun on the path of self-determination. You free yourself from the realm of illusions and distractions and everything else, to the extent that you are then free to live according to natural law, which means the development of a healthy, righteous state of mind and just habit of mind. And that is free will in the biblical sense. So that isn't necessarily completely ruled out by what Spinoza's idea of freedom is here, even though he's not calling it free will. I think the freedom from constraint might be in the sense that you are constrained by what God has willed, but that's not the same as being a slave, So only if you thought of God as this sort of authoritarian figure that's trying to crush you, would would be determined by God's will, would that be a problem for you? So yeah, I can't see that if you take these three ideas of freedom, I can't see that it's really that out of kilter with what Spinoza's saying. So like I say, I'm not necessarily saying I don't believe in free will of some kind, but let's just see how far this can get us. I mean, so yeah, obviously I've already covered what Dugin's saying, and the fact that we've gone from essentially the idea of brotherhood to otherhood. So we now live in this hell of otherhood where we're so atomized as individuals that we've lost the ability to think of ourselves as human. And so so the idea of the relationship of the individual to the collective is obviously a sort of thorny issue, but I think that one way that I've kind of looked at it, whether it's people agree with it or not, I don't know, but the way I've kind of looked at it is that we have examples of what is called social animals in the animal kingdom. We have examples of animals that are kind of quite resourceful as kind of individual units, or sort of family units, let's say. So we've obviously got the well-known ants and bees and termites and that sort of thing. But obviously what distinguishes that idea of society, that's not really true society. That's just us being stupid and calling it something that it isn't. Because there's no individuality in that society at all. Whereas if and an individual ant lacks the resources to survive for a minute on its own, Whereas you take something like a family of beavers, the other thing is that ants can transform their environment in a certain way. They can build, huge, amazing sort of underground sort of colonies, and beavers, for example, are a kind of more individual type of animal. So they have the resources to survive on their own, independent of a kind of collective of beavers, and they can make radically the environment around them and modify it in a way that sort of suits their natures, But again, they don't have society, and so you've got these two things that kind of exclude one another. Whereas with human beings, you've kind of got the mutual interaction of these two mutually exclusive, but for human beings mutually affirming principles. So for human beings, in order to be a genuine, true member of society, you're not just a kind of a factotum. You're not just a thing that is pushed around by society and you just act in accordance with the sort of hive mind. In order to be a true social being, you can only be a genuine social being to the extent that you fully realise your individuality. And by individuality, let's just see the second side of this thing. You can only be a genuine individual to the extent that you realise yourself, your individuality, in and through your existence as a social being. So if you take both of these aspects, for human beings, genuine individuality is inherently a collective thing, something that binds you to the collective. obviously through culture, and principally within culture through language, because as an individual, your perspective on the world is a historical perspective. It's the perspective of everyone that has ever done anything or lived and left a trace of themselves, either in the language, the culture, or in things around you. So yeah, for me, that is an idea of what the relationship of the individual to the collective is. But getting back to the, if I can find it, the idea of the Spinoza and free will. So, as he says, that free will would be a faculty in addition to the intellect. Freedom is realised by being true to our nature rather than being compelled by external forces, i.e. passions. Since we are compelled to act by passions rather than acting freely as active agents. So for Spinoza, it's about the development of human agency rather than the development of free will. I mean, it kind of makes more sense in a way to me to think of it like that, because, free will doesn't really develop. It just, as an idea, it couldn't really develop because it's something that each of us has and just kind of goes around in little circles all the time. Whereas human agency can develop because, by improving the human condition in your lifetime, you hand down to the next generation a world where their agency in relation to nature is developed on a different level than it was when you took over the reins of, when the previous generation handed you the reins of human civilization. So it does have that kind of idea to it. And so this development of human agency, as opposed to being passive, and to be passive would be to act purely in relation, be like an animal, to act just in accordance with your passions. So in the slave in the garden story that I had in the previous one, the death in the garden rather, the slave does act freely by trying to escape death. So in that sense, he's active. He's an active agent. If he'd been kidnapped by bandits and dragged to the inn where he meets death, then he would have been passive in relation to his thing. So he still has a fate. It's still certain, and it's going to happen. Not just certain, but inevitable for under Spinoza. But he can still act as an agent or not. The end result is always the same. But to go back to our musical analogy, you could have a musician in an orchestra that can throw themselves into playing the score and through that create a work of great beauty. Or you can have a musician who's got the is just in a proper sulk and just moodily plays the thing, in which case he is actually being passive because he's acting according to, he's being compelled to act by his passions rather than acting freely. Obviously you could have a musician that throws themselves into playing the score to such an extent that they starts doing almost a jazz improvisation halfway through, in which case it's gone too far. So there's a balance to be struck here. Another example that's often used, I think, in literature relating to Spinoza is the idea of a dog tethered to a car. It can either walk along behind the cart or be dragged. You know, in which case, the first time it's actively following along. In a second one, it's just being dragged along as a passive thing. Or to use another example, you could have a farmer who decides that he's going to identify himself as a musician, as a magician, and instead of sowing his seeds, he's just going to cast a spell, and next winter his larder will be magically filled with food. Or you can have a farmer that, you know, he sows his seeds, he reaps his harvest, and he actually has food the next winter. You know, so by freely conforming to the necessities of the dictates of his situation, one farmer actually becomes free. The other farmer is condemned to starvation the next winter. So yeah, I mean that to me is a kind of a outline of what is kind of rattling around in my noodle about freedom and the kind of liberal idea of free will. Maybe we need to just have a little think about it, you know, because if you think about what Dugin's saying, you know, this whole liberal ideology is kind of tearing us apart as a civilization, and we kind of need to, you know, get a handle on this, because it's not looking good otherwise. Anyway, that's that.